Hello there, it is Jo from Minerva, and today I'm here to do a video on how to sew boiled wool. If you've not sewn boiled wool fabric before, or you've not chosen it for a project before, I thought I would show you a little bit about how you might choose your design features, how you might choose your techniques and skills, and how you would put together something like the Parker Coat from Stylark. If you are choosing a boiled wool, then you need to be mindful of the type of pattern that you choose to make with this fabric, because it's really bulky, and when you do a bit of a test before you start, you will find that even just a couple of seams will soon start to add a stack of fabric. So here, that's 4 layers of the boiled wool, and it's really thick. So around the neck here, I have 2 layers of collar, the facing and the outer fabric. So round that neck edge there are 4 layers of fabric. For that reason, you need to make sure that the pattern that you pick is suitable for making in boiled wool. If you do think you're going to get some issues with bulky areas like this, then you might want to think about swapping out some of your fabrics so that you have the boiled wool on the outside and maybe your facings are in something different. So I've used facings here for this side facing, but I could have made the back facing inside in just a piece of cotton poplin, and that would have reduced bulk at the back of the neck. You might find that selecting a different fabric as the second piece would be really useful as well on maybe a pocket flap. So on the outside you get the boiled wool, and underneath your pocket flap is just a poplin fabric. You can see an example of it here. It's a beautiful jacket. It's got more details than I would sort of recommend for a boiled wool garment, but because they've switched out some of the fabrics and some of the facings, it works. Another element which is part of the selecting process is that if you're making something in boiled wool, you probably can't interface it because you can't get enough heat into the wool to bond the glue on the back of iron-on interfacing, and it doesn't stick, and it doesn't really do anything in terms of adding stiffness because you're already getting the stiffness from the fabric. If you do have an area that needs stabilising because boiled wool is a little bit stretchy, then you need to choose a sew-in interfacing, not an iron-on one. Another selection thing to be mindful of is that if you select boiled wool, you don't need to do any seam finishing because the edge of the fabric is the edge of the fabric. It doesn't fray. It's all matted and felted together. You can use this to your advantage, so you can use that cut edge in your jacket. So on this Parker Coat, instead of folding under the edge of the pockets, I've kept them raw. So I've got a raw edge pocket. It's got 2 rows of top stitching holding it down, and I have repeated that feature on the collar. So instead of having like a really rounded, bumpy, lumpy collars, I just put the 2 collar pieces together, top stitch them, and that way I get these really nice points. I wouldn't have got that if I'd sewn them right sides together and turned it out. It also means that on the inside you don't need to finish any of your edges, and on the hem it's just turned up and hand sewn, but I didn't need to double turn it or add any different seam finish. Same on the seams are all exposed. If you do want to take some care over the seam finish because you will see the inside of your jacket, you can bind the edges like here. So a bias binding has been applied to the edge of the fabric, finishing it off so when you see on the inside you get that little flash of colour. This is called Hong Kong seaming, and you can find out a little bit more about that in my video here. It's easy to do, it's just a little bit time consuming. Another part of your preparation you might do before you use boiled wool or indeed make any kind of coat or jacket is to wear what you're going to wear underneath the jacket, so you can sort of estimate that. So put a long sleeve t-shirt on and a sweater or whatever you're going to wear, and then measure your high bust. That will give you a really accurate measurement of what you want the coat to go over, and then use the finished garment measurements on the pattern. Don't just choose the generic women's size, because that can be a little bit variable and different between different pattern houses. So take your upper bust measurement, compare them to the finished garment measurement. That will give you a good fit around here. You'll get plenty of clothes on underneath, and you'll also be able to work out what's the ease in this jacket. Some coats, like the Nova Coat, that's got a lot of ease in it, so there's lots of room inside. So even if you make the smaller sizes, it will still be an oversized coat. So you need to make sure that the finished fit of your jacket is what you're expecting to have. I cut out my Parker coat and boiled wool with a rotary cutter. I knew that the blade needed changing on my rotary cutter, so I cut out the whole of the boiled wool coat here with my rotary cutter, but not with a new blade, because it really blunts your blade quite quickly, this sort of thicker wool and lots of fibres. If you want to use scissors, you can do that, but I wouldn't use scissors that you use for finer fabrics. I use these Genome scissors. This pair, without anything in the handle, that's for finer fabrics, so I'd cut challis with this, or cotton lawn, or lining. This pair with the little label on, that's telling me that I've cut thicker fabrics. This, I've cut denim, I've cut boiled wool, I've cut lots and lots of layers, and these are a little more rattly because the blades have been forced open. So if I was going to cut this with scissors, I would use these, because it might just force the blades open a little bit more. You can tighten them after you've cut it, but it does blunt the blades a little bit more. So keep these for finer fabrics and use a pair of scissors that maybe will get a little bit blunt during the process. What you essentially want to know is, will any scissors that I pick up cut through? Because it's not stringy, doesn't fray or anything. You just need to be able to cut through the thick fibres. You don't need to pre-wash boiled wool. All of the washing and the pre-treatment of the fabric has been done. That's what's created this sort of felted, nubby texture. So you don't need to pre-wash this before you cut it to make your garment. You can just go ahead and cut out. Remember, because the fabric doesn't fray, you could actually use it as a feature on the outside of your jacket. So you can sew your jacket in reverse. Here's a great example here. So the two layers of fabric and their seam line have become a feature on the outside of the jacket. You wouldn't press this, you wouldn't steam open the seams the same, because you want them to stay together and be on the outside. Boiled wool isn't classed as a stretchy fabric, it's classed as a woven fabric, but just by the nature of how it is put together and made, the fibres can move around. So you do get a little bit of stretch and give, and sometimes we want that. That's great in a coat. So around our shoulders, it'll be really malleable and it will make nice shapes on the sleeve heads, but we don't want it to stretch out particular areas. So on my coat, I've used some tape on the shoulder seam, because this is quite a weighty sleeve hanging from that shoulder seam, and because it's a drop shoulder, I didn't want it to really stretch out or make a sort of little V shape. So you might need to stabilize the shoulders if you're making something in boiled wool, or maybe make sure that you stay stitched around the neckline. Let's take a look at sewing some boiled wool, and I can give you a few tips on how to get the best stitch line. I'm using a ballpoint needle in my fabric, and you probably associate that with jersey, but actually it's really great in this slightly stretchy, forgiving felted boiled wool. And the reason is because it's got a really smooth tip on it. So if you've got an old needle in your machine and there's any tiny little burrs on the tip of the needle, they will pick up the fibres and then they will tangle them all up with the thread coming through the eye. So make sure you've got a new needle for a boiled wool project, because you need it to go smoothly through all of those matted fibres, and a ballpoint needle is absolutely perfect. Another tip for sewing boiled wool is to use a walking foot if you've got one, because the layers are quite thick when you've got them together, and they move along, and because of the nubby texture, they sort of grip on each other, and once they've got a little bit of a lock from one little knobbly bit to another, then they lock on, and then they will start to sort of drift. The top one will drift away from the bottom one. You can use a walking foot. If you don't have a walking foot, you're just going to need to pin a lot and sew quite slowly, and make sure that you're pushing the fabric towards the foot, not pulling and trying to smooth it away. The more you try and smooth it away, the more you'll be getting a discrepancy in your seams. Let's see how it works. I've sewn the seam on quite a long stitch length because I want the seam to peel open a little bit. If I have it on a really tight stitch length, then I will get this sort of furrow down the seam. I won't be able to press it out flat because there'll be no thread there to just give me a little bit of allowance. So you can press the seams out on the reverse. I'll show you some pressing seams in seam tips in a moment. But then it becomes much more stable. If you want this seam to be a little bit stretchy, you can sew it with a zigzag. So when you open it, you might see a little bit of the stitching, so you need to make sure that you have a really good stitch combination, but this time your seam has a little bit more give. So if you want to use that around a sleeve head, that's useful. If you want to use it around, if you've got a fitted coat, so you can use a zigzag stitch, and because the fabric is so thick, you won't see that it's a zigzag. So you can try a straight seam, which is stronger. You can try a zigzag seam, which is a little bit stretchier. Or if you absolutely don't want the seam to stretch out, then you can put a piece of stay tape underneath so that you're sewing through 2 layers of fabric and a piece of stay tape, and that will stop it moving altogether. The mistake I kept making when I was making this coat was I kept forgetting to put the foot down because there was such a thick layer underneath. It looked like the foot was down just because the distance between the foot and the feed dogs was full. Then I started sewing and I was thinking, oh, this doesn't sound right. And then I realised that I hadn't got the foot down and I'd sewn a whole seam. So because you're filling the space between the foot and the foot plate, you need to remember to put the foot down. Just a little tool tip, as you start to maybe put 2 layers together, or you then add your pocket, you'll find that you need some pretty long pins. So I've got quite a long firm glass head pin, which I used, but even then, sometimes around the collar where it was curved, it was much easier to use clips because the clips held together the layers much more firmly because the pins just sort of got lost inside the boiled wool. So that's a great way to hold your seams together before you sew. If your coat has a little bit of shaping, so for example, if it has a dart, it's really hard to not have a really sort of spongy lump on your dart because from the back you've got quite a lot of fabric. So you can cut that dart out. So once you've got it on and you've fitted it and you know you don't need to make any more changes, you can do a couple of things. So you can either cut your dart open and press it so that it's all nice and flat, or you can even cut some of that off. So you can do a cutaway dart and take out some of the bulk. And you'll be able to press that, and already just through my fingers it feels better. And from the reverse you'll just have 2 very slim pieces of boiled wool to be contending with on the reverse. Talking of pressing out a dart, let's go and see how to press boiled wool. Here I am treating the shoulder seam, so I don't want to put the iron directly on the fabric, so I'm going to use a press cloth. I've got my my iron on a wool setting, so I'm just going to hold and press. You can add some steam, but not directly to the fabric. And then the heat is in the press cloth, so then I can press down with the clapper. You can hold that down with anything firm, and you can see it presses open the seam. From the right side, you'll still see it's a little bit bouncy. We've still got that furrow, so you can repeat the process on the right side, but it's always good to do a little press test before you start. The heat is in the fabric, and then the clapper presses it down. You get a really smooth finish, and that looks so much better than before. If you've bought your boiled wool and you've had it stored for a while because you've been waiting for the right pattern to come along, then you will need to get those creases out before you cut. So because you can't apply your direct heat to the boiled wool because you'll stretch it and you'll make it a different shape, you need to make sure that if you've got quite a few sort of creases, real memory creases in there because it's been folded a long time, you apply some steam to the whole piece of fabric, keep smoothing it out, do that on the reverse, and you'll be able to get rid of those creases. But that way, if you steam the whole piece of fabric before you cut out, any kind of adjustment in size will happen to the whole piece before you cut out. If you start cutting it out creased and then getting the creases out of each piece, you might start changing the shape of each piece. My top tips for your sort of finishes are, well, mine is, first of all, not to pick anything with too many details. So buttonholes and things like that are tricky to do, but they are possible. You can do bound buttonholes, hand sewn bound buttonholes, or this coat hasn't got any at all, so that's quite a nice feature. It just makes a sort of swing coat. The bottom is hand stitched, and it's actually a real joy to hand sew down the hem of boiled wool because you can easily pick up some threads from the wrong side, some of the fibres, without going through to the wrong side. So you don't get anything showing here, but you can really secure the hem down. If you want to top stitch, then you're going to need to really try and layer out some of your seams, otherwise you'll have too much bulk under the machine. I'll show you the inside of my coat. So I wanted to have a top stitch all the way around the neckline, holding the facings down, but I just couldn't. It was just too thick. So I took my top stitching along the front facing, around the neck, and here at the shoulder seam where I had the shoulder facing, the collars, the outer, the seam binding and everything. It was just too thick to get under my machine. It was skipping stitches because I'm not treating my foot very nicely. So I just stopped before there. I left the back, so that's not been top stitched. Then I picked up again on the other side of the shoulder seam and top stitched here. So when I wear it, I get all of this lovely top stitching on show, which holds all of that side facings, the front facings in, all of the back facing. But from the back, I don't have any top stitching, but the collar is standing up on its own. It doesn't need it. And sometimes you've got to work with boiled wool, you can't work against it. If you do have front fastenings, then you might want to choose a couple of different techniques. So there's the bound buttonhole that I talked about. You can also cover press studs. So my tutorial is here, and it's how to cover a press stud. So you can use a fabric to cover it, a fabric that sort of works with your boiled wool. And then you don't get that industrial sort of dressmaker's telltale that you've made your jacket. Those look like really couture, really smooth, and they look like they're supposed to be part of the jacket. It looks like you wanted press studs, you haven't had them because you didn't want to make a buttonhole in boiled wool. In combination with the press studs, you can self-cover buttons. So it's quite hard with the boiled wool, but it is quite nice if you can get it going. There's a lovely example here where they've been embroidered and then they're used on a coat. So if you put press studs on, you can put a button on top of that, so it has the illusion of buttons without having to make the buttonholes. Finally, I thought I'd give you a little bit of inspiration if you fancy sewing up some boiled wool. You're really tempted by that non-fray fabric that's really warm and cosy. This one, first of all, is the Papercut Coat from Style Arc. Really simple, unlined, easy to put together. The collar is just that little bit different. It's high at the back and then it sits flat at the front, so you don't have to try and get your collar to roll over or sit in a particular way. It just sort of does it on your body, and it's a really nice feature. New Look 6585 is a really great coat pattern for using boiled wool with. There aren't too many features. It's got that sort of really overcoat easy style. We had a kit in this. I don't know if it's still available, but you could check that out over on our website. It's got pockets, it hasn't got any fastenings, but it just rolls really nicely on the neckline. If you like a statement collar, then Butterick 6244 is another one with a sort of big collar, but this one's got a waterfall collar. And the advantage to using boiled wool here is that you don't have to do any hemming along that waterfall edge, so it will hang really, really well. You could try this one in a viscose boiled wool. That way you'll get a little bit more drape on that front collar, but it works just as well with the 100% wool. If you like a little vintage style, then Simplicity 8509 is a vintage style coat. It's got those sort of wide sleeves. This one is lined, so you will be enclosing all of the seams on the inside. A little bit more of a tailor's make, but a real special coat. I love a unisex coat, and this pattern I Am Artemis jacket is perfect for that. You can have it with pockets, you can have it with fastenings, you can have it without. It's great for teens, men, women. It's got a really, really diverse wearability. This would look great in boiled wool. You wouldn't have to line it if you didn't want to, but you could also line it if you have a great fabric you want to put on the inside. I Am Patterns also make a cape pattern, so I think that's a great choice for boiled wool. It's warm, you get that sort of nice stiffness in the collar, and the seam lines can be pressed out using the techniques that I've shown you, and you get a really nice shape, a really warm, cosy winter garment. I mentioned the Minerva coat, that is from Papercut Patterns. It's a really oversized jacket, really comfortable, easy to wear, but that has a lot of ease in it. So do check out other makers who've made the Minerva coat, because they will give you a little bit of an idea of the sizing that they chose. I've saved the best till last because Tessuti patterns have some real corker patterns for using with boiled wool. I've actually got 3 to show you. There is the Leon coat, so that is a shorter jacket, so that's sort of like a Chanel style. It's got hardly any features, but the ones that it does have are really class. So it's got really great satin sleeves, the buttons down the front, and it's a short boxy style. Verona is the pattern that I'm coveting at the moment. It's a short little boxy coatigan. It's got a collar, so you don't need to finish the edges of that. You can have it just as a cut boiled wool collar. Same for the pockets, and you can turn the cuffs back and have that as uncut boiled wool as well. It's a really neat jacket. I tried one on at a show, and I've had that pattern on my queue for a while. Again from Tessuti is the Florence, and this is a coatigan, so this is a long line style again. So I'm hoping that I've given you quite a range of patterns there, coats and outerwear that you can use with boiled wool. All of the patterns and the boiled wool that I have suggested today are listed below. So if you see the products underneath our Minerva feed, or if you're on the YouTube channel, you can click below in the details and it will take you straight to that link. We would love to see what you have been making. So if you've made anything lately, or you've tried boiled wool, or you've done one of those patterns, we would love to see it. It really helps to inspire our sewing community. Create a free account, share your makes, and show us what you've been up to. You can also go over to our website or here at Minerva YouTube channel for more videos. There are learn to sew ones, sew alongs where someone makes something from start to finish, and lots of pattern and fabric inspiration from Vicky. Thank you very much for watching. Do call again soon.